This is our sixth lecture of our series, and this one is on the topic of Confucianism, which is one of the most important philosophies that has relevance for China and East Asia and East Asian medicine, and really it's one of the most influential world philosophies of the history of the world. But it's also kind of one that, especially in the West, we don't really necessarily have a familiarity with. It's definitely kind of contained to East Asia, but it was very highly influential in East Asia. And if you're from the West or you're a Western acupuncture practitioner, you may not have any contact or interaction with Confucianism. And so, but I think it's important to kind of understand a little bit about Confucianism, even just the basics, because Confucianism is really at the heart of Chinese society throughout the entire time that China was an empire. And so having just a basic understanding of Confucianism can help us have some pretty good context for maybe some of the ideas that emerged in East Asian medicine. So let's jump into our presentation, and we're going to just kind of have like a basic overview of Confucianism and how that might be influential to East Asian medicine ideas. So just as a little overview for our lecture today, we're going to be talking a little bit about who was Confucius. We're going to be talking about the Analects of Confucius, which is the main book that is part of Confucianism. We'll get into that. We're going to be talking about some of the moral virtues and some of the aspects of Confucianism itself, like the philosophy and the important concepts and values of Confucianism. It has a lot of ethical values, and those have bearing too, maybe like in the morality and ethical nature of medicine itself. And we're going to be talking about maybe some other Confucian philosophers. There are other philosophers in the vein of Confucianism, and they follow in his footsteps and kind of advance the philosophy that he originally put forward. So we're going to take just a little bit of a look at that, because Confucianism has a history for thousands of years, essentially, in China. And so it evolves as the empires and the times go by. So we're going to look at some of the other ancient Confucian philosophers, and then later in our course it might come up again when we look at what we're going to call Neo-Confucianism. And then we're going to importantly tie this all together with some conversation about how Confucianism is directly influential in East Asian medicine, and we'll look at a couple examples of that, and then we will wrap it up with some conclusions. So just to start off, Confucius, who was he? Well, he is the foundational philosopher that founded Confucianism. And Confucianism is a philosophy that shaped Chinese culture, its ethics, and its governance for over 2 millennia. It influenced education, like the entire educational system was essentially a Confucian system. It influenced the family structure, and its goal was really to establish social harmony. It was, the goal of Confucianism is harmony and balance and a peaceful, properly run society. Confucianism becomes the state ideology of the Empire of China. This happens in the Han Dynasty, basically, and his teachings become the basis for example, the imperial Chinese bureaucratic system. So the civil service exams, they're all embedded with Confucian values and how to run the government, how to run the state and society. The officials of the government were Confucians, essentially. They had kind of like a monopoly on the bureaucratic system of the empire, the Chinese empire. So the officials of the emperor who did all of his jobs for him, and he commanded them to basically run the empire. They're his bureaucrats. They were basically all Confucians. So they were a very important and kind of high class echelon of society, very educated, literate, and well read and scholarly class of people. And so this had a tremendous effect on society. Most of China were essentially part of a peasant class and, in a sense, illiterate. They didn't have a formal education necessarily. And so to become a Confucian scholar and actually be part of the administrative state of China was an extremely rare thing for something to happen. You would have to study basically your whole life. Your family was probably wealthy and gave you a formal education, and then you'd have to study for your entire life. It was highly competitive, and if you became a Confucian scholar, that was like the highest honor that could basically be granted to somebody in the empire. Um, so the cultural legacy of Confucianism, it's spread beyond China. It impacts other East Asian cultures like Korea and Japan and Vietnam, and it remains a cornerstone of Chinese identity despite some pretty drastic modern shifts, which are actually in quite in opposition to Confucianism, which we'll look at kind of in some of the later lessons. We'll look at how there are often like reactions against Confucianism. But ultimately, Confucius remains one of the most controversial and influential figures in really all of human world history. So just a little bit about his life story. Confucius was born in 551 BC in the state of Lu. It's during that spring and autumn period at the end of the Zhou dynasty. And Confucius comes from a pretty modest, possibly noble family. And his father was deceased, and he had a young mother. And in his early life, he was largely self-educated. He developed a passion for learning, and he studied the ancient texts, specifically the important texts of the Zhou dynasty. He studied ritual and music, and all of these things kind of shaped his philosophical outlook. He very much was a adherent to the high culture of the Zhou dynasty. That was like his thing. And his career, he was a minor official in the government in that state of Lu that he lived in. And so that includes a magistrate, and he was a minister of justice. But due to the political instability, he left office around the age of 50. And he spent his life traveling around China to the various states. This is like during the Warring States period, where there's all these states that are fighting one another. This very important 100 schools of thought and Warring States period. Confucius is traveling around for 13 years amongst the various states, and he's seeking to try to find a ruler of a state who will adopt his ideas, his philosophical ideas, because he feels that if a ruler adopts his if a ruler adopts his ideas, that ruler will be able to establish a virtuous government, similar to how the Zhou dynasty, in their original founding of the Zhou dynasty, they were very virtuous rulers. They ruled with virtue. So Confucius wants to establish another virtuous state, and he thinks that if an emperor follows his philosophy and is truly virtuous, then he will create a harmonious, peaceful society. However, he really was not successful in this. He never really found that person to institute his ideas, and he kind of failed in that task. Although ultimately he was actually like quite successful, because Confucianism became such a important philosophy school of thought, and later on it became the most important philosophy of the Han Dynasty and then subsequent dynasties after that. So he founded a school, and he taught a bunch of different disciples on topics like ethics and governance, personal cultivation. He emphasized moral leadership and social harmony. And some of those ideas, those are all kind of in that book, The Analects of Confucius, where it's not even really written by Confucius, it's written by his disciples, and it's a collection of his sayings and stories of when he was alive and his interactions with his various disciples. And it's a really fascinating, interesting book. Later in his life, he returned to that state of Lu, and he focused on teaching and editing classical texts, for example, the I Ching. And then he died in 479 BC at the age of 72. So his teachings, his legacy, is recorded in the Analects by his disciples, and that becomes the foundation of Confucianism. It profoundly influenced Chinese culture and East Asian thought. So just for context, just to take a quick look back at our map of all of these Chinese dynasties, we are in lesson 6, and realistically, we're still here, right on the borderline of the green and the blue. Because like I said, this is some of the most important time period of Chinese history. And Confucius lived during this Warring States, this spring and autumn period. And that's when he was traveling around and teaching his disciples. However, then when Confucianism becomes really like the orthodox philosophy of China, that happens after the Qin dynasty unifies China, and then is overthrown by the Han Dynasty, that is when Confucianism really flowers into its real kind of into its mature self, because that's when the state itself actually becomes Confucian, like explicitly. And so from the time of the Han Dynasty all the way down through here, up until the founding or the fall of the Qing Dynasty and the end of the entire empire period, the imperial period of China, which is kind of how the time period of the modern age of China, modernity in China. This whole entire Chinese historical period, Confucianism is pretty much, you can consider it the most important philosophy of all of pre-modern China. And there's other philosophies in the mix. There's Taoism. Later on, there's Buddhism that emerges kind of during this sort of time period. And here it starts to become very popular and throughout time. There's other influences, even remnants of like things like legalism, but Confucianism really is the most important and most influential philosophy of the dynastic imperial period of China. And all of the ideas of Chinese medicine, which happen during this period, they happen in that context of Confucianism. The people who come up with those ideas are in many cases Confucians. Maybe they're not Confucian bureaucrats in the government, but they're Confucians in the sense that that's what informs their worldview. So they see the world through the eyes of a Confucian person and the Confucianism philosophy. And so it's important to kind of have an idea of like, hey, how do these people see the world? And we can do that by learning a little bit about Confucianism. So the Analects of Confucius, like I said, is the main book about Confucianism. There's other books as well, but this is like the important one, the most important book. And it is a collection of the sayings and dialogues and teachings of Confucius, compiled by his disciples. And this is after his death. It consists actually of 20 books. There's 20 books compiled together. And they're short aphorisms and sayings about ethics, government, education, personal conduct. It emphasizes moral virtues, self-cultivation, concepts such as the rectification of names and other topics meant to create a harmonious and virtuous government. And the historical significance is that it shapes all of China's history. And here's a quote by Confucius himself where he says, "To learn and at due times to practice one what has learned, is that not also a pleasure?" So little sayings like that, and that kind of speaks to his emphasis on the importance of learning. This that importance of learning and the idea of self-cultivation really becomes a very important idea just generally in medicine too, because as a doctor, as a medicine person, you are also a Confucian in a sense in ancient China. And so it's so important for you to study the ancient texts, to study the classics, to become a scholar, to study the medical classics, even the Confucian classics, all of the classics, to really become a scholarly, erudite, intelligent human being in morality, in medicine, in whatever you're doing. That is kind of the ideal in a Confucian society. They want you to be a scholar, a self-cultivated scholar. So with the onset of Confucianism in society, we're kind of going from that demonological perspective of the Warring States period to this natural philosophy. This is a theme that we've touched on and kind of like talked about a little bit. And this is kind of encapsulated in a few of these quotes by Confucius. So Confucius says, "Devote yourself to the proper demands of the people. Respect the ghosts and spirits, but keep them at a distance." So what he's trying to create is like create a separation between this worldview of like everything is ghosts and spirits, and he's saying, well, they may be real, but we're going to keep them at a distance. We're going to focus on what's actually important here, which is the demands of the people. Then another quote says, Confucius says, "I have not yet mastered the way of humanity. How could I master the way of ghosts and spirits?" So that's another quote that's kind of like grounding his perspective in the natural world. He wants people to focus on the real world, the world of humanity, the world of which we live in, which we have to govern, which we have to rectify the real world so that we can have harmony and peace in society. And to him, he thinks everybody's focused on ghosts and spirits. And actually, that's kind of the wrong way to go about things. We need to focus on the real world. So for him, he's like, well, I haven't even mastered the real world yet, the world of humanity, the way of humanity, how to be a human. So why should I be concerned with the ghosts and the spirits? Then he also says, when you have not yet under when you have not yet fully understood life, how can you understand death? And to me, that's kind of another way of saying sort of the same thing. Why focus on the afterlife and this other world that may or may not even exist necessarily when we're in this real world that still needs work. We have work to do to kind of make it the right way, make it a harmonious, livable place. So Confucius had great respect for these previous paradigms of ancestors and spirits and demonological ideas, but he treated them with reverence. But his philosophy was very pragmatic and it focused on human affairs. So instead he turned to things like virtue, ethics, education, and his primary goal was cultivating goodness and benevolence. So, in a way, the Confucian worldview, it's kind of, in a sense, it negates the demonological worldview in a way. So, this is a quote by another Confucian philosopher, which we'll mention in just a little bit. His name is Junzi. Junzi says, when one prays for rain and it rains, what is the connection between these two events? I say none at all. If the sun or moon are consumed or eclipsed, someone beats drums to rescue them. If a drought comes, one prays for rain. If an important decision is to be made, the soothsayers and shamans are consulted first. But no one has ever achieved any success through such activities. Everything is purely ornamental. The true ruler recognizes it as decoration. The folk believe in the involvement of spirits. So Junzi is mincing way less words here than Confucius, and he's just outright calling it out. He's kind of saying like, that stuff's just decoration. It's just ornament. It's not real. And actually, we need to focus on what's real. So there is this philosophical tension. These worldviews are not always in agreement with each other. And in fact, they're often very much in disagreement. So the ideas of ancestors and spirits, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, as we'll talk about later. These philosophies sometimes do have things in common, but they're also very much also often in conflict with one another, and they disagree on very fundamental things. And yet, at the same time, the ideas which emerge from all these various philosophies, they coexist as a pluralism in East Asian medicine. So let's take a look real quick at what's called the 5 moral virtues of Confucianism. Number 1, we have benevolence. This is called run, and it is regarded as the cornerstone of Confucian ethics, representing compassion, humanity, and the ability to empathize with others. Then we have wisdom, zhi, and that involves informed judgment, the ability to understand the motives and the feelings behind actions, and the capacity to discern the best course of action for virtuous ends. Then we have righteousness, which is yi. That's moral integrity and the commitment to act ethically, even at personal cost. Then we have sincerity or trustworthiness, and this is considered the foundation of trust and integrity. It requires honesty, reliability, and consistency in word and deed. Then, last but not least, we have what is called propriety, or sometimes ritual propriety. And that encompasses things like ritual and etiquette, social protocol, like decorum, basically. And that ensures respectful and harmonious interactions. It extends beyond mere formality to include the proper performance of rituals and adherence to cultural norms in various social contexts. So if we think about these 5 things, we could really kind of think about in a sense, as East Asian medicine practitioners, as acupuncturists and herbalists, we can think, how do these things apply to the clinic? That as a person engaged in the act of medicine, how do these virtues, do they have application in the clinical environment? Well, I think they do. You have to be a benevolent person. You have to be behaving out of sincerity, and you have to be a trustworthy person. Those are all ethics that we're familiar with. You can't just leak people's personal medical information. You have to be you have to sincerely be trying to solve their problems. You have to be doing it out of compassion and benevolence and righteousness, and you need to cultivate wisdom so that you know how to do that and have the capacity to make like proper judgments. And really, even beyond that, there's just a certain amount of like ritual propriety that has to be performed in the clinic. You can't just be a jerk. You have to treat people with respect. There's a certain way to behave. So, if you think about it, in really all social environments in society, these are operating. And so Confucius just makes these things very explicit, and he points them out, and he kind of defines them as saying like these are the important things that we have to pay attention to as a virtuous person. So I think they have a lot of application too in like medical scenarios. There's other important concepts too in Confucianism. One of them is called filial piety. And filial piety is a foundational virtue in Confucian ethics. It emphasizes the moral obligations of children towards their parents and elders. It's rooted in respect and care and devotion. It's considered the root of virtue and the basis of philosophy by Confucius, who viewed it as central to creating a harmonious family and, by extension, a stable society. The concept is not merely ritualistic obedience, but involves an inward attitude of sincere reverence and gratitude, driven by the recognition of the debt that children owe their parents for giving them life and nurturing them. And so you can see this really in like all of East Asian culture. Generally speaking, it's a very important virtue. There's a tremendous respect and people adhere to that towards their parents. And much of this might even evolve from the reverence that's given to ancestors that we talked about, even stemming back to things like the Shang dynasty. This might be an evolution of that, but Confucius says, in serving his parents, a son may gently remonstrate with them. If he sees that they do not incline to follow his advice, he shows increased reverence, but does not abandon his purpose. So that's just kind of like he's talking about there's a middle ground. You don't want to be so overly critical of your parents, but if you see that they're doing something wrong, you might want to gently what's called remonstrance. You might want to try to gently correct them, but you want to do it out of reverence. So it's like the remonstrance is actually something we're going to talk about in a little bit, but the idea is that the virtuous person tries to do remonstrance to those that are maybe higher up in the echelons of society. Like if you're an advisor to the emperor, you might remonstrate with him. If you see that he's doing something wrong, you might say, hey, be careful, you might want to think about this. Even though sometimes criticizing the emperor might be a dangerous thing to do, he might say, hey, don't criticize me. Same thing with your parents. There's these social hierarchies in the society that can be a challenge to traverse, but also it's a necessity. It's a Confucian virtue necessity that you might have to tell people the truth sometimes, and they may not like it. But point is, though, that there is a tremendous amount of reverence and respect and gratitude that is afforded to people's parents and their elders in East Asian society, and that's based on filial piety. Then, like I said before, there's this ethics around learning. Confucian learning is a holistic, lifelong process centered on self-cultivation, moral development, and the pursuit of virtue, aiming to transform the individual and contribute to societal harmony. It emphasizes effort, critical thinking, questioning, and practice, with learning viewed as both an individual and a collective endeavor that deepens over time. The ultimate goal is to realize the way, the Tao, through the cultivation of Ren, which is humanity or benevolence, and the practice of Li, which is kind of those ritual normative behaviors. And with education, it serves as a means to achieve personal and social excellence. Confucius emphasizes a love of learning, which persists through life. You have to really love the process of learning, and that's why in our first lesson, I put that paper on the concept of lifelong learning and self-directed learning. I kind of feel like that's a way to express this Confucian love of learning. And so Confucius says to quietly persevere in storing up what is learned, to continue studying without respite, to instruct others without growing weary. Is this not me? So he really sees himself as this lifelong learner who truly just loves learning. He's kind of the archetype of the educator and the teacher. Social roles are important in Confucianism. There's this quote from Unschuld that says, the real cause underlying the obvious social unrest was the discrepancy between the expectations associated with social roles and the actual conduct of members of society, including the ruler, whose behavior was expected to be exemplary. So social roles bind individuals and groups together. You have to behave the way that you're supposed to behave in a Confucian society, right? It's very structured. It's very structured and categorical. You know, the ruler is supposed to behave a certain way. I mean, Confucius thinks he's supposed to be this very, very virtuous person. He's the exemplar of virtue. That's how it's supposed to be. The same thing with, like, for instance, a father in a family. The father is supposed to behave a certain way. If he's not behaving in that proper way, that's going to create a very chaotic, disruptive situation in the family. And it goes both ways. The same thing if you're a daughter or a son, they have very, very specific prescribed ways that people are supposed to behave depending on what that social role is. And you can have many different social roles, you know. So these relationships, they regulate mutual obligations between people and society. And it's less of an individualistic philosophy. It's more of like a relational way of being. So in the West, we live in a very, very individualistic society, which has positives and negatives in ways. But if you compare that to the kind of Confucian worldview, the Confucian worldview is much more relational. You are your relationships in society, and you are those social roles. And your behavior and maintenance of those social roles reflects upon you as an individual in a very, very powerful way. So, specifically speaking, in Confucianism, they talk about these specific relationships as being like primary. So, you have a relationship between like a ruler and a subject. You have the relationship between, for instance, like a father and a son, husband and a wife, the elder brother and the younger brother, the friend and another friend, like a colleague relationship. This is a very patriarchal society, so just FYI, but that's part of it, you know, like that's just the nature of things in this worldview. It's so Confucian relational ethics, they're centered on these five relationships. This is kind of like a foundation of like harmonious relations in society. The principle of filial piety, you know, that gets applied to things like father and son. It's considered that respect for elders and ancestors serves as the basis for other virtues like being a humane, benevolent person. So this emphasis on duty and proper conduct within all of your relationships, it's guided by this concept of li, ritual behavior. You need to behave a certain way. You know, if you were to meet the emperor, you need to like bow. That's proper. That's the proper thing to do. You know, in our modern society, maybe you meet someone, you shake their hand. That's kind of like how you would maybe consider the ritual behavior of our modern Western society, right? So that's what kind of these ritual conduct things are. They're like decorum. They're how you should behave in your relationships and your the way that you interact with people, basically. So while the relationships are hierarchical, they are also meant to be complementary and balanced with the expectation that those in positions of power act morally to inspire respect and obedience from those above. Which is to say, like I said, if the ruler is not behaving morally, that leads to problems. That degrades respect for the emperor and the dynasty. And ultimately, if that goes on for a long enough time and it degrades to a point that it's just unfixable, that can lead to a revolution, and that happens over time, many many times over time in China. So Confucius has this idea called the rectification of names. This is like a full crash course on Confucianism. You don't have to become an expert on it after this. I'm just letting you know you don't have to. The takeaway from this lecture is I'm not a Confucian expert, but this is kind of like we're touching on a lot of the things about Confucianism. It's a pretty broad overview. So the rectification of names is this idea that designations of status should in reality correspond to the conduct of those on which they were bestowed. That's from Unshold, a quote from Unshold. And the idea is if an emperor is a bad emperor, is he really the emperor? If a father is behaving like a bad father, is he really your father? You know, the father is supposed to behave a certain way. So I guess like in a Confucian worldview, like if you say somebody adopts you, he's not maybe your biological father, but if he treats you the way that like a good father treats you, he's your father. You know, that's like that person is essentially your father. Whereas maybe your biological father abandoned you or treats you horribly and disrespectfully in the way that a father is not supposed to behave, maybe according to the rectification of names, you would consider that person not your father. So the rectification of names is essentially the idea that names should directly correspond with actions and the proper behavior of that thing. So the rectification of names uses language accurately to reflect reality and maintain social order. It holds that names, titles, roles must align with their true meanings and corresponding duties. When names are rectified, individuals fulfill their roles properly, ensuring harmony in society. For example, a ruler must act justly to deserve the title ruler. Misalignment leads to confusion and chaos. So Confucius says, let the ruler be a ruler, let the minister be a minister, the father a father, and the son a son. And that is to say that you need to behave properly according to who you are and what your role is in society. And this idea of rectification, you can kind of think about it in medical terms too, because in our system, in our bodies, we have all of these systems, all of these organs, all of these different types of chi. And each type of chi is sort of in its own way personified. You have the liver as the general, you have the heart as the emperor. But the idea is that certain types of chi should behave a specific way. That is, there's a certain proper way for chi to behave. The stomach chi is supposed to go down. If the stomach chi goes up, it might lead to nausea and indigestion or vomiting. So if there is a disharmony in something, in a chi dynamic, that also needs to be rectified. So the idea of rectifying a misbehaving type of chi, you can kind of think about that as like a Confucian response. You want to you want to fix that. You want it to work the proper way. You want to rectify the dynamic, and you're going to use acupuncture and herbs and different types of tools to basically straighten things out. You want things to be zheng, straight, proper. You don't want things to be chaotic or evil or malicious or disorderly or rebellious. You want them to behave the proper way, the Confucian way, the way that it's supposed to be in society, and that's going to bring harmony outwards in society, but also inwards in your body. So that's kind of how I think, like, there's these parallels between this Confucian philosophy for the outside world, but also it applies to the inner world with Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine, because really we're trying to make things proper in the body and the dynamics that are happening in the patient. So we're like the Confucian scholar, but we're the Confucian doctor in a way. We're trying to fix society, but the society is their body. So then this other concept is called the doctrine of the mean. That is, Confucius says, you must follow the mean. The doctrine of the mean is this Confucian principle that emphasizes balance, moderation, and harmony in behavior and thought. It advocates maintaining equilibrium in all aspects of life, aligning actions with moral virtues and the natural order to achieve personal and social harmony. The master says, to go too far is as bad as to fall short. So the goal is to achieve personal harmony, its moral excellence, and social order through ethical equilibrium. That's to say that, like, don't go to the crazy extremes. You want to stay in a moderate, kind of controlled, sort of like conserved situation. That's in the Confucian mind, that's where virtue is. It's away from the extremes, extreme behavior, extreme conduct. The Confucian is a very moderated, sort of balanced person in a way. That's their ideal. So balance is a big thing for Confucianism. So, the doctrine of the mean, it emphasizes balance, moderation, and this creates harmony in behavior and thought. Chinese medicine takes this influence and emphasized balance, moderation, and harmony as a means to engender health and to avoid illness. So for example, excesses or deficiencies in qi and blood, for example, that's a cause of disease. You have to moderate your diet and your lifestyle habits to avoid disease. You can have disease as a result of drinking too much alcohol, eating the wrong types of foods and excesses, or eating not enough food and becoming malnourished. Either of the extremes lead to a different kind of disease situation. Overwork and exhaustion or overconsumption is seen as a cause of disease. Excesses in things like sexual indulgence, drugs, or something like that, that's seen as a cause of depletion. And avoidance of the extremes in the elemental world, the environment, that is also a way for us to avoid disease. So the Confucian avoids the extremes. He stays very balanced in a moderate kind of harmonious way in that type of sense. Then there's this idea of self-cultivation. In Confucianism, self-cultivation is the process of developing one's moral character and virtues through things like education, reflection, practice. It involves striving for personal improvement and aligning oneself with ethical principles like run, which is benevolence, and li, which is the ritual propriety, and fulfilling one's roles in society to achieve harmony and moral excellence. So the master says, that's Confucius, if a man does not constantly ask himself, what is the right thing to do? I do not know how he can be considered a man. And then here's another quote from Confucius. He says, that what the superior man seeks in himself, what the small man seeks is in others. So it's this focus on internal self-improvement. You're not looking at other people, seeing all the things that they have. You want the money that this person has. You want maybe like a beautiful partner or a hot Ferrari. It's like you're seeing all these things. You want to get Jeff Bezos's yacht. Confucius would say, no, 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 no. Don't worry about all these excessive things. Like don't worry about these indulgences. Don't worry about what other people have. Worry about your own inner self cultivation. Cultivate your virtuous morality and your character, and don't care about that stuff. That's kind of his way of going about things. And the person who does that, the person who cultivates a excellent moral superior character, is called a junzi. That's the superior person. And so the definition of junzi in Confucianism is sometimes like as a gentleman or a superior person. And so, if as we go through this, some of this language is pretty much like skewed towards masculine and male figures, but in my opinion, it applies to all of humanity. That's just part and parcel to kind of the Confucian worldview and that worldview at that time. But these topics and concepts really are not just for men; they're for women too. They're for everybody. Anyone can cultivate their moral character. It was just that in the time period that Confucius lived in ancient China, in the imperial dynasty, it was a very male-dominated society. So just keep that in mind as we talk about this stuff. The intention isn't to make it about men, but I just wanted to say that. So that's why I try to think about it more as like this is a superior person. And so the junzi is a superior person. They're an ideal moral individual who embodies virtue, integrity, and ethical conduct. So the key traits of a junzi is that they practice run, which is benevolence. They practice li, and that's the ritual propriety. They practice yi, which is the righteousness. They act with sincerity, with humility and wisdom in social roles and relationships. And their role in society, unlike a petty person who's focused on self-interest and getting those things that they see other people have, the junzi prioritizes moral excellence and contributes to social harmony, and they serve as a virtuous model for other people, a model of virtuous conduct. Confucius says, wealth and honor are what people desire, but if they are gained without the way, they should not be held. Poverty and loneliness are what people dislike, but if they are avoided without the way, they should not be escaped. And so this kind of reflects the junzi's adherence to virtue over personal gain. He doesn't really care if he gets like all those good things, or even if they're a poor person. They don't really care. They're more concerned with just being virtuous, having a very cultivated high character and an ethical sensibility, and just being a good person, basically. The master said, the junzi understands what's right. The petty person understands what is profitable. The junzi associates openly with others but does not form cliques. The petty person forms cliques but does not associate openly. And then Confucius says, the junzi seeks to perfect the admirable qualities of mankind and does not seek to perfect their bad qualities. The petty person does the opposite. So we want to be a Jinza as doctors, as acupuncturists. We want to be very high character, virtuous acupuncturists. So Confucius, you can kind of think of Confucius. Yes, he's an educator, but to be honest, at the heart, at the root of Confucianism, it's really more of a transmission, I think, is what he would say. You can think of Confucius as a transmitter. And that's because Confucius was really trying to transmit the things that already existed. These ideas weren't necessarily new with him. It's not like he invented virtue, but he's saying that these people back in the Zhou dynasty, like King Lun and the people, the founders of the Zhou, these were virtuous people. We should look to them as moral exemplars. And these are all of the things that they embodied when they ruled with virtue during that beginning of the Zhou dynasty period. And so he even says this specifically. He says, I transmit, but I do not innovate. I am truthful in what I say and devoted to antiquity. I venture to compare myself with our old Peng, which is a person that he's talking about. But what he's basically saying is that he's devoted to the way things were back then. Confucianism's a very backward facing philosophy. It's not saying that the new is good because it's new. It's saying actually quite the opposite. It's saying that like things were better in the old days. And this aspect of Confucianism, in a way, is kind of what creates so much controversy and tension with Confucianism throughout the many eras, because it's kind of like a very conservative philosophy in that way. It's like things were better in the old days, and we need to go back to that. Things were better in the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. We have to go back to that. And many other people might say, well, actually, the old ways were backwards. We don't want to go back to the old ways. We want new ways. And so in the future, there is a lot of philosophical conflict that happens between Confucianism and other emerging philosophies, which we'll talk about when that time comes in future lessons. So, but we can think of Confucius himself as a transmitter of ancient wisdom. He's not necessarily a creator of new doctrines. So Confucianism is a philosophy. It looks to the past for inspiration. Throughout the centuries, this focus on antiquity and tradition creates powerful friction between those who want to restore the glory of the past and those who want to create a new future untethered from the past. And so this is exemplified when Confucius says, the Zhou dynasty is able to survey the two preceding dynasties. How rich a culture. I followed the Zhou. So really, that's really what Confucianism is. It's like Confucianism is the continuation of this culture, this tradition that goes back to the Zhou dynasty. It's really so like if you're a Confucian, you are part of a tradition that links back to those founders of the Zhou dynasty. That's where it kind of starts, and it links back to that culture. Because that is the model to Confucius of virtue and culture. So just to touch real quick on a couple other important Confucian philosophers, we have this one guy called Mencius. That was, and these people are not too far off from the same time period as Confucius. They just come a little bit later. So we've got Mencius on the left, and we've got this other guy, Junzi, on the right. And if you're interested in either of these philosophers, we have this is an interesting translation of a good translation of Mencius by Brian Van Norden, who I really like. He's got also some really awesome philosophy videos about Chinese philosophy on YouTube, which I highly recommend. And then there's also Junzi. This is another translation of Junzi on the right. So Mencius is known for his optimistic view of humanity. He thinks human nature is inherently good. He emphasizes moral cultivation and the heart mind, the Shin, which we're familiar with. And he thinks that's central to ethical development, and with parallels to Chinese medicine's focus on nurturing inner balance. And so let's just see two quick quotes from Mencius. He says, human nature is inherently good, just as water flows downwards. There is no one who is not good, just as there is no water that does not flow downwards. And he says the heart mind is the organ of thinking. If you think, you get it. If you don't think, you don't get it. This is what heaven has given us. Now, in contrast to that, they're both Confucians, but they have a little bit of a different idea about human nature. You have Junzi, who took the idea that actually human nature is inherently flawed by its nature. And because of that, it requires rigorous education, training, and ritual to achieve goodness. And so, in a sense, this also parallels with Chinese medicine's structured approach to correcting imbalances. And so, couple quotes by Shunzi, he says, human nature is evil, actually. Its goodness derives from conscious activity. The nature of man is such that he is born with a love of profit. And so ritual is the means by which to rectify the heart and cultivate the person. When ritual is established, the self is rectified. So I just think, kind of pointing out these differences between these two Confucian philosophers is interesting. It kind of, even though they both are Confucians, they have a very different idea about human nature. And if you apply that to medicine, it kind of has a different idea about how things are. Like Shinza thinks things by their nature go wrong and are not good necessarily. And it's our job to rectify them and make sure that we train them very rigorously to become straightened and proper and good. Whereas Mencius thinks that things are automatically good. They're by their nature, they're good. So just a different idea. It's just an interesting dynamic and difference. But most importantly, we want to think about, being that this is the history of East Asian medicine, we want to think about how does Confucian thought influence medicine? We touched upon this, already touched upon a couple ways as we go through our lecture here, but specifically, let's look at how that happens. We can say that many medical concepts are developed or can be understood through the lens of Confucianism. Medicine itself is often likened to the virtuous administration of government, but instead of regulating the empire out in the world, we're regulating the chi of the human being that's in front of us. We're trying to regulate that dynamic. Just the act of regulation, that's like a Confucian thing to do to something. So for one, we can see the body as a microcosm of the larger world, which is like a macrocosm. It's like the body is a microcosm of the environment or the empire. Within the body, there is its own heaven and earth. There's yin and yang. So just like the world out there. And so just like Confucian society, there's an ideal empire out in the world. There's also an ideal configuration that should be taking place in your body. And the goal, maybe as a Confucian, is to order the world externally to be good. And, by creating a good moral example and being one of those junzas and being a really good, bureaucrat in the Confucian state or whatever. But then as a doctor, we're working with people on an individual basis. We want to order their inner state, their inner chi. We want to order the disharmonies that are happening with them and the dysfunctions that are happening there. We want to create a harmonious, peaceful, ordered state internally for them, and that will negate the disease or the problem that's going on. So we use another way that Confucian influences medicine, and this is kind of interesting, is in Chinese herbal medicine, herbal formulas are constructed as if they are like bureaucrats in the state. Like each herb is a bureaucrat in the formula. So the herbs themselves, they serve relationship roles just like you would serve in the empire. And if you're in the Chinese herbal medicine program, you kind of learn about this a little bit. If you're not, that's okay. But, we're going to be talking about Chinese herbal medicine ideas. And so just so you know, it's like, even if you're not in the herbal program, you're going to get a little bit of herbal medicine action in this course. But when an herbal formula is created and composed in herbal medicine, it's thought of as the herbs, they serve a different purpose or role. Some of them are very important roles, some of them are just supportive roles. So sometimes in an herb formula, you have like the main herb. The whole formula is based around a single herb and the main properties of that herb. That herb would be considered the emperor of the formula, right? It's like the main emperor, king herb of that formula. You might have maybe secondary herbs that are performing supportive functions or secondary functions to that main herb. Those are like the ministers of the formula, just like ministers of the empire. So they're maybe not performing the emperor's duties, but they're doing important roles nonetheless, important things to support that And then also you have other parts of the herb formula, which you can think of as envoys. And so certain herbs have the wonderful ability to maybe convey those actions of the emperor and the minister herbs and the formula as a whole to specific meridians or specific organs. And so those are considered like envoys. And so, this is just the idea of like they are using this lens of seeing the world through this empire Confucian lens, and they're applying it to herbal medicine. And so the herbs are thought of in terms of their relational and bureaucratic roles in the formula, which I think is just like so fascinating. You also have the organs and the bowels themselves, those zong fu organs and bowels, and they get anthropomorphized. And we learn about that in our education. We learn about how they become, for instance, like I said, the liver is the empire, or the liver is the general, and the gallbladder is the soldier, and the heart is the emperor, etc., etc. And or for instance, the intestines have important purposes for they're like the ditches that get rid of refuse, and the stomach is like a granary that holds food and grain and resources and things like that. So they get anthropomorphized either as like Confucian officials and bureaucrats in the government. Like the lung is like what, like the prime minister or something, or they get kind of like thought of as like granaries or storehouses in the empire that are play an important function, because that was one of the most important jobs of the emperor back then, is like to make sure that people had food. There's like all these droughts, there's natural disasters, there's floods, there's famines, there's plagues, and that would happen all the time. And you have to try to prepare for those eventualities by making sure that there's enough grain stored in granaries and stuff. And so they use this like old bureaucratic Confucian worldview, and they kind of apply it to the body. And so that's where we get some of these ideas about the organs. And then, like I said, we have this concept of qi being upright or proper. We talked about this a little bit in some of these articles that we looked at in the course for the, if you're in our Wan Institute course. And so the qi can be upright and proper, which is to say, like kind of like how a Confucian should be, or it can be evil and perverse or malicious, which is like xie qi. That's when you get that aggressive energy stuff. You have qi that is behaving like not according to ritual propriety. It's behaving against the norms. It's going the wrong direction. It's doing the wrong thing. It's attacking the body instead of supporting the normal bodily functions. Like an autoimmune reaction might be considered like a xie qi situation. If the stomach chi is going up instead of going down, that's like, okay, that's like stomach chi, perhaps. Things like that. The Confucian ideal is we want things to behave correctly. That is a key word in Confucianism: correct, proper. It is very much an orthodox. Like they want things to behave the orthodox way. So, if it's behaving a way that is like perverse, according to them, it's like, hey, you're doing things the wrong way. Like they don't like that. That, according to their ethical system, is wrong. They have a very clear definition of what is right and what is wrong in Confucianism. They don't mince words or split hairs about it. They're just like, this is right, this is wrong. Do what's right, don't do what's wrong. And that applies to the body as well. So it's, in medicine, there's a certain way that things should happen and a certain way that things should not happen. And so the job of the doctor and the acupuncturist and the herbalist is to correct those issues, correct those ways that she is behaving disorderly and dysfunctionally and disharmoniously. And to do that is basically to be behaving like a Confucian, but in a medical environment. Uh, this is just something actually that I translated from a book that I'm translating. This is from not from the Han Dynasty, which is that old Chinese dynasty where Confucianism first becomes, the main philosophy of China. This is from a much later dynasty, which we're going to look at, and we're going to actually talk about this book a little bit when we get to that period of time. But I just thought this is such a really cool part of the book because the author of this book, in his preface, talks about how Confucianism and medicine are very similar things in the world. They have very similar goals. They're really kind of like two peas from the same pod in his mind. And so this is a translation of him talking about that. So I'm just going to read this to you. I think it's just a really fascinating way to make connections to Confucianism and East Asian medicine. So this is the author of, by the way, the Grand Compendium of Acupuncture and Moxibustion, the Zhenjiu Da Cheng, and that's from the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so he says, it is well known that the way of medicine is clearly connected to Confucian scholarship, and that their merits are equivalently matched. It is not because the Confucian applies the entirety, sorry, he says, is it not because the Confucian applies the entirety of their heart to prescribe the dose of medicine which can bring peace to the whole world? Likewise, medicine revives the afflicted and reanimates the chronically ill, elevating the whole world in benevolence and longevity. Their affairs are together equally meritorious. However, if Confucians fail to exhaust the classics and return balance, then their actions will certainly be perverse and ultimately not helpful in the least for meritorious governance. And yet physicians treat the excesses of the six qi, distinguish between the movements of the five directions, and investigate the 100 causes of disease. Their theories are furnished within the written texts of an unestimated number, which are collected into hundreds of kinds. On the other hand, specialists in this profession fail to exhaust their theories and obtain a comprehensive, skillful know-how. I have yet to see their results match their abilities. I humbly offer an analogy. Those who grasp at prescriptions to treat the diseased follow the residual threads of legalist thought. Those who practice guiding and conducting without medicines follow the strategies left behind by Huang Lao thought. And yet all are insufficient to gather the meritorious achievement of peace and harmony, principally because they deviate from Confucianism. So I just think this is such a fascinating piece of text. You know, it number one, it talks about how obviously the author of this is himself a Confucian, and he's kind of saying that um, Confucianism and medicine have basically the same goal, which is to create harmony and to bring benevolence to the world. And Confucianism, the goal of Confucianism is to do that out in the world in the society at large, and the goal of medicine is to do that in the individual that you're treating. And these are equally meritorious goals, right? And but he says he's lamenting that it's often the case that Confucians fail to achieve their goal, and they actually can sometimes have the opposite effect because they do it wrong. And this can be applied also to doctors. You know, if you treat people the wrong way, you could actually cause harm in a sense. And sometimes this is because they don't apply themselves to learning, that that Confucian idea of learning and self-cultivation. They don't apply themselves properly, and so they end up maybe not matching the results that they should have achieved. And so he's saying that rather than chase the threads of legalist thought and Huang Lao thought, his idea is that, like, if you're just applying prescriptions, oh, they have this, then do that. That's kind of like you're applying legalist medicine. And if somebody is just giving people prescriptions on what he calls like guiding and conducting, which is sort of probably like qigong, tai chi, and various kinds of like movement therapies, which is very much in the vein of Taoism. We're going to learn about that in our Taoist lesson coming up. He's criticizing that. He's saying, well, that's Huang Lao thought. And he's saying, well, these people aren't getting the results that they want because they're not following the Confucian way of doing things, which would be, I suppose, to be regulating and rectifying the body using acupuncture and herbal medicine, because this and moxibustion, because this text is primarily about acupuncture. So that's just a kind of a fascinating little tidbit to add in there and talk about how, like, even throughout the ages, there are these little conflicts and philosophical conversations and disagreements that are arising between the various philosophies. So one thing to note about Confucianism, you know, compared to the previous paradigms of thinking that we were talking about, like the demonological medicine, is that with the advent of Confucianism and natural philosophy and all this kind of good stuff, there's really like this newfound medical agency that the individual has. It's grounded in the fact that man has the ability to shape his own destiny, and this is because you can behave and conduct yourself according to virtue, and you can behave the right way. It's no longer a chance matter of like being attacked by demons and spirits and stuff. And this is what Unschuld is saying. He's saying that the individual and society may be threatened by certain natural processes, but they can protect themselves by carrying out appropriate measures. The Confucian doesn't go out in extreme weather and expose himself to the wind and the elements and the cold and the heat. He stays moderate. So the individual responsibility for personal existence within the context of impersonal natural laws. So now the individual has more agency. They can behave certain ways. They can learn how to avoid illness. They can treat illness by rectifying it and regulating it with the tools that we have. So all this is to say that all of this natural philosophy, all of this Confucian philosophy is giving humans much more agency over their medical existence in life during this period of time, during the Han Dynasty. Just to touch real quick on just the idea of like regulation and stuff like that, rectification, governing. We hear these words as we go through our acupuncture training, right? It's like we need to regulate the acupuncture meridians. We need to regulate the chi. I kind of think about this as like, these are Confucian terms in a sense. These are ideas that maybe like without knowing it, we're kind of behaving like a Confucian. They reflect the way that Confucianism attempts to manage affairs of the empire in order to create peace and harmony. So acupuncture, moxibustion, herbal medicine, etc., all of the tools of our, very pluralistic medicine, their goal is to rectify, regulate, and govern the chi of the body. Using these techniques, doctors can rectify disorder. They can treat perversity and chaos and rebellion, and they can do this by making them correct and upright and straightening them out. That, in essence, at its foundation, is kind of like the goal of Confucianism. That's what we're trying to do as a Confucian, if we were Confucians, and that's kind of what we're doing as doctors. And then this is an article which actually is part of our lesson this week. It's this article on remonstrance, which I just quickly touched upon briefly earlier. And this is kind of a way that, Confucian ethics sort of enters into the conversation as we're in the clinic and stuff, because the Confucian bureaucrat, the Confucian scholar, if he's working directly for the emperor, it's considered important that he remonstrates with the emperor when the emperor is doing something that's not virtuous, it's not correct, and it's going to cause problems. The idea is that the Confucian scholar should be should talk to him about it, and should maybe like give him some gentle criticism about it, and maybe show him the right way to do things. And by doing so, he's performing his duty properly. And I sort of think that this applies also to the clinic. We get a lot of patients in the clinic, and our job is sort of to be like their Confucian advisor sometimes, because they don't know maybe how to do things. They don't know how to solve these problems. That's why they're coming to us. They're coming to us for advice. They're coming to us for perspective and for our expertise. We are these Confucian scholars who know how things work, essentially, if we want to keep going with that vein of thinking. And so it's our job to sometimes tell them, hey, you might need to cut back on this or that. You might not want to eat this so much. You might want to, start doing this type of exercise or this type of regimen. We need to talk to them about their practices and their habits, and teach them how to incorporate good habits, and teach them how to, maybe some of the things that they're doing are actually bad for their condition. Sometimes people have all of this dampness in their body. And when you talk to them about their diet, you learn, oh, well, they're just eating and drinking everything that causes dampness all day, every day. And, you know, it can be difficult to broach those subjects sometimes. You don't want to like be so crass with it that they're like, oh, well, this guy's a jerk. I don't want to ever come back to this clinic again. You kind of have to do it gingerly and gently within the realm of ritual propriety and sort of help them understand that we need to gently change these habits for you, because if we don't, then the problem's going to get worse. But if you do, then the problem's going to get better. And by educating them and, and being honest, even though they may not like to hear this, we're performing remonstrance. We're being a Confucian doing remonstrance for our patients. So I just think that's a cool way to like kind of tie in Confucian ethics into East Asian medicine and actual like in actual clinical scenarios. It's our job to do that. So in the article it says straight words, using ritual and decorum to correct a person's faults. The remonstrator uses ritual and decorum to correct them. An insider employs remonstrance to correct the ruler's faults. Remonstrance is a kind of stopping. Remonstrance and remonstrating argumentation is using straight words to awaken people. Confucianism also incorporates a lot of these ideas from like yin and yang and wuxing, the 5 phases. And you can see this in Xunzi says, because these are like the laws of heaven. Like in ancient Chinese cosmology, this is like the physics of the universe, So he who approaches the laws of heaven in an orderly fashion shall be blessed with good fortune. He who approaches the laws of heaven with disorder shall suffer misfortune. Heaven shall not allow those to fall ill who ensure that the vital necessities of life are present in sufficient quantities and that the appropriate efforts are made at the correct time. So this once again talks about how like we have all this medical agency because now we live within the framework of these natural philosophies, yin and yang, wu xing. We know how to behave at certain times. We know when to do things and when not to do things. We can behave and conduct ourselves appropriately, and by doing so, we're going to avoid illness many cases of the time. And by doing so, we'll stay healthy, we'll stay virtuous, we'll stay proper, we'll stay good. All this applies to medicine. Even though Xunzi is not really talking about medicine most of the time, he's like, it really turns that way. Upright and proper zheng qi from a Confucian perspective. Confucians think that there is a moral, correct, upright, or proper zheng way for things to be. In terms of medicine, health is a function of the zheng proper qi. When the qi is proper, upright, and correct, there is no place for disease. Disease comes from xie qi, which is malicious, evil qi. Xie qi behaves perversely, causing injury to the system, much like someone behaving incorrectly in life. If any type of qi, such as that of an organ system, is behaving irregularly, rebelliously, or oppositional to the correct way, it is a source of disease. Excess or deficiency is one example. If the zheng qi is deficient, it is more likely that external xie qi can invade, such as wind cold. The role of the doctor is therefore to eliminate and prevent xie qi and to support and regulate zheng qi. Regulation brings correctness to the system, just as Confucians sought to bring righteousness and regularity to society. And so we have a little article in our lesson that talks about zheng qi, and this is just a graph from it. But the idea is that zheng qi is pretty important. It's like really when we're doing acupuncture and we're regulating people's qi, we're really kind of working with their zheng qi, their proper qi. We want to scatter and expel and get rid of this xie qi that has occurred for whatever reason. And we want to correct the flow and the quantity of the zheng qi. We want it to be strong. We want it to not be deficient. We want things to be in proper proportion, in the proper place, at the proper time, doing the right thing. And that will lead to health. So that's kind of what we're doing. This is all sort of like a Confucian perspective, because the zheng qi, by its nature, it's talking about correctness, what is proper. It's talking about things in terms of Confucian philosophy. That's kind of a Confucian medical term. And one of our last but not least things to talk about is this very fascinating formula from Chinese herbal medicine. And this is just one more example of how Confucianism influences herbal medicine. This formula is called Se Junzi Tang. So we talked about the term Junzi earlier. The person who created this formula straight up called it Junzi Tang, which is to say there's four junzas in the decoction. Tang means decoction, right? So there's four noble or virtuous people in this decoction. Each of the four herbs themselves, they're saying, is a junza. And so you can kind of interpret this formula as like a Confucian herbal formula. Its job is to replenish the qi, strengthen the will, sharpen the senses, improve the thoughts, cultivate virtue, and become a superior person. Its goal is to turn the person into a superior person, into a junzi, internally. It's to augment the zheng qi, basically. This is like the foundational, most basic qi tonifying formula in the herbal medicine materia medica, basically. It's just these four herbs. And you can add other herbs to it to do other things. You can add herbs that tonify the blood, and then it becomes a different formula. You can add two herbs. You can add citrus and pinelia, and then it becomes the 6 noble drugs decoction. But the usefulness of the term junzi is a clear reference to Confucianism. And in this article, which is in our lecture this week, in our lesson, the formula is so named because the inherent character of the four herbs is royal and virtuous. They have a mild nature and support the body's functions. They do not harm, and their qualities are well suited to the organ system of the stomach and spleen that they are aimed at treating. So we can see how these ideas related to Confucianism and also other philosophies, when we'll look at an herb formula similarly to this in our Taoism lecture, we can see how the ideas of these philosophies directly influence herbal formula composition, how we think about herbal formulas, the way that doctors were thinking in their mind when they were creating an herbal formula. They named it after these ideas. So the point is, just to hammer it in, is that really Confucianism is inescapable in East Asian medicine. You can't escape it. It's just part and parcel to it. It's the soil that East Asian medicine blossomed out of. And we don't want to ignore the soil. It's just like when we're growing food, right? If you want to grow healthy, delicious, organic, nutritious food, you have to pay attention to the soil health and the soil quality. You want to pay attention to the soil, what it's composed of. The soil of East Asian medicine is in many ways composed of Confucianism and these other philosophies like Taoism, etc., etc. So that's why we're looking at them, and that's what this is all about. So in conclusion, for our lecture today, Confucianism, it becomes the orthodox philosophy of China, and it's also very influential for all of East Asia as a whole. Throughout the entire imperial era to the modern age, Confucianism is the main orthodox philosophy of the Chinese Empire. Confucianism influences the worldview of every individual practicing Chinese medicine during all of imperial times. It's inescapable, really, because it's just so foundational. And the influences of Confucianism can be seen in various aspects of the medicine, just on a foundational level, which is what we kind of talked about in our lecture. So in conclusion, though, understanding these basics of Confucianism, which we went through today, I think that this gives modern practitioners insights into concepts and important ideas of East Asian medicine in ways that we may not have thought about or recognized or considered previously. And we may never have even we may never have even interacted with Confucianism before. And so having this kind of, even just a basic understanding of what Confucianism is all about and how it's approaching life and medicine, we can gain good insights into our practice of East Asian medicine, and also gain insights into how we want to practice and behave as a practitioner, because of the ethical and moral virtues of Confucianism, in a sense, are inevitably fused with East Asian medicine, because we need to become basically scholars, and Confucian principles of self-cultivation apply to the lifelong pursuit of becoming an acupuncturist and working with medicine. So That's our lecture for today. Thank you everyone for tuning in with me in our wonderful Confucian overview, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to maybe talk about and instill some Confucian concepts into your medical practice. So I will see you next time for our lecture, and looking forward to it. Have a great day.